Greetings, audience, and welcome. My name is Janet Denise Kelly, and I'm the Executive Director of Sanctuary of Hope. I want to thank you for joining us today on Hoover for a very important conversation on redistricting. I couldn't think of anyone better to moderate a timely discussion with an esteemed panel at a time such as this than Dr. Anthony Samad, the Executive Director of the Dimely Institute. Redistricting is knocking at our front door. Meetings and public hearings are in process, as well as maps are being drawn that can influence political representation and economic assets. Regions and communities of interest are battling to stay intact or remain whole, while some are on the verge of being split or losing a seat at the table. We need to have a good understanding of redistricting's impact now in this late stage of the process, as well as what we need to do to get involved and to increase awareness around what's happening in our front yard and at our front doorstep. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Anthony Samad.
Good afternoon to our audience. Today, we are highlighting our Black Narrative series with a discussion on redistricting. We'd like to thank Sanctuary Hope and its CEO, Ms. Janet Kelly, for giving us the opportunity to discuss this critical issue in our community. We have a very well-rounded panel today, a panel of thinkers and as well as a panel of actors that have been involved in redistricting processes historically here in Los Angeles. Some are new to the process, some are like me, old to the process, but the bottom line is we have seen how it has impacted our community. Let's talk historically about redistricting and what the redistricting process represents. After each census, we have been doing redistricting in the United States since the Constitution was 10 years old. The formation of this country, Constitution started in 1781. And once the Constitution was adopted, it said every 10 years, the population would be counted, okay? And that represents a national count, which is called a census. After the count takes place, then what we generally see is each state is apportioned its representation, which is how the House of Representatives is formulated. And the apportionment process determines that each state is equally represented by the number of people who are in their states, and it examines which states have a gained population as well as which states may have lost population or which states have retained population. And once that is determined, then the states themselves go through what is called a redistricting process. And the redistricting process basically seeks to ensure that everyone within the state is adequately represented, and they are able to determine the shapes of the districts based on where their populations are identified geographically. And so in a state like California, which has been the most populous state for nearly a century, we basically have our population concentrated in three areas: Northern California, Central California, and Southern California. And those particular regions compete for representation. We don't necessarily like to say it like that, but that's the way it has played out. How has that impacted the Black community? Well, largely our representation is centered in either Southern California, Los Angeles County, or Alameda County in Northern California. And generally, we lack representation in other areas of the state until recently. And the representation, of course, was based on the fact that wherever African Americans were living at the time, then these districts, particularly in the 1990s, when laws were passed to ensure majority minority districts, we saw, for instance, federal representation grow. The Legislative Black Caucus grew from 11 members to nearly 40 members. But in the 21st century, since the 2000 census, we've seen two things happen. Okay, we've seen the population of whites decrease, and we've seen the emergence of a new model minority, which is what African Americans were called. We were, for the first time in this nation's history after 2000, African Americans were not the largest ethnic minority in this country. That shifted to Latinos. And so in the last two censuses, okay, we've seen the emergence and growth of both Latino and Asian representation under the laws that districts be drawn not to disenfranchise ethnic minorities. Historically, when redistricting maps were drawn, they sought to do one of two things to African Americans and other minorities. They sought to pack them in a single district, and that term is known as packing, or they would split them to where they would have less than a third of the population count, and they're oftentimes unable to elect a minority member, whether it was Congress, the state legislature, or local government. And so in the last two censuses, there has been this move against packing or splitting. Yet what we have seen is that while packing may have gone away on some levels, splitting continue to exist. And then when you look at the demography shifts that have taken place, historically communities that were African-American and had African-American representation moved west or moved to the suburbs being a 1980s, 1990s phenomenon where Blacks began to move to the suburbs, and thus their population counts went down in urban cities. And so how did that affect us? Well, in the 1990 census, what we saw was a significant shift west, okay? Whereas a representative like Maxine Waters, who once represented Watts, okay, suddenly her district, moved west, and, then she's representing Inglewood, okay? And then in the 2010 census, suddenly she's representing Torrance, as African Americans moved into some of the South Bay cities. Or we began to see a merging of districts. For instance, in the 2000 census, okay, we saw districts, state districts in particularly, merge. Okay, we saw the 47th, 48th merge on the west side. Districts that were once held by Marguerite, Archie Hudson, and Gwen Moore suddenly just produced one representative, and once term limits came into effect, then we lost a seat. In the 2010 census, we saw 2 districts that were merged, congressional districts that were merged, districts that were once represented by, for instance, Juanita Milliner McDonald, and later Laura Richardson was merged into a district that was represented by Janice Hahn. And so we saw 2 incumbents running against each other. Okay. Subsequently, Janice Hahn won that seat. And then we saw that seat pass, from an African-American to a white woman to the current representation, which is Latino. What did we see in terms of local government? We saw basically those districts split. And even though we have been able to retain local representation, we saw the council districts stripped of assets. The 9th district lost downtown, but also lost Watts. We saw, essentially the 8th and the 10th district stripped of assets and competing for African-American populated centers like Leimert Park and Baldwin Hills and Windsor Hills, and the historically Black areas, which was West Adams, which was what we called South Central at the time, and what we called South LA, which is Watts, Willowbrook, and Wilmington. We saw those districts basically competing for African-American populations in order to maintain a 40% threshold and African-American representation. And so these are the types of things that we are now facing after the 2020 census, particularly when some of the numbers are telling us, some of the early returns are telling us as many as 1.2 million Black people weren't counted in the what they call the COVID census. And the threat that many of these seats are going to have Black populations split again, where the inability to retain 3 local city council seats exists. We also see some districts like the 59th Reginald Jones Sawyer district, where African-American population has fallen so significantly that he himself has said on more than one occasion that he is going to be the last African-American representative of that particular assembly district, which is a sad predictor, to the fact that African-Americans are relying solely on African-American population positioning in order to win a seat. We African-Americans are going to have to learn to win seats in which they're a non-majority, and we begin to see that in counties like San Diego County and in the Inland Empire, San Bernardino County, where African-Americans have been able to retain seats despite not being an African-American majority seat. So voter sophistication and census sophistication now comes into play in terms of political sophistication. So the conversation we want to have today, particularly at this point in time where they're drawing maps and the maps are being presented that do not necessarily favor African-American communities. And it appears one critical thing, and I was going to let Mr. Watkins address that in the last census, Watts was drawn out of the 9th district. Okay, but let's talk about the process of selecting commissioners and selecting people on these municipal commissions that can advocate for certain communities. Ms. Carolyn Williams is someone that I have known for longer than she cares for me to say, but she's been in the community for a long time, both as a funder, a corporate funder, and as a thinker. She has been a supporter and constructor of nonprofits. She is currently on the board of several nonprofits, even though she says she's getting off boards, including she's the past board chair of the Donnelly Institute's advisory board. But she's also at this time on the county redistricting committee. And she has been involved in the process, and she was one of the finalists to get on the state redistricting committee. And so she has a lot of insight as to how these maps are being pulled together and what the African-American community needs to be aware of in terms of how political competition is thick behind the scenes. And so let's hear from her first, and then I'll get to the gentleman. But set the table for us, Carolyn, in terms of what this process has brought about, and go beyond the criticism, the constant criticism that we're hearing that the African American community hasn't been involved as stakeholders, because on some level that's true, and on some level that's not. And so we'll dissect that or analyze it according to how you present it.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Samad, and I'm pleased to be here representing the county. Just to get it started to talk about the county process, we were created. This is the first time to be an independent commission, which means we were not appointed by any of the current sitting supervisors. We were selected by a process that it was totally independent. The first 8 commissioners were selected by a drawing of the most qualified. I think there were about 700 considered most qualified. And then that 8 selected the final 6. There are 14 members. We represent the districts. Our goal is to represent the county of Los Angeles demographics equally, which means in terms of ethnicity, in terms of political parties, in terms of gender, and anything else. So the 14 members, there are 2 African Americans here. That's proportionate based on the number of African Americans in the county. And so we're made up, and we're not split equally among the parties because there are more Democrats in LA County. Just something about the population. I think we all know LA County is larger than 25 US states. So we're talking about 10 million people. Each district, there are only 5 counties, 5 districts in LA County. So each district has 22 million people. And that's larger than a number of states. So we're talking about supervisors who have immense power. The goal is for them to understand the communities they represent and to be responsive. And when you have 2 million people, the question is how responsive can they be? Because we've heard from communities as we've been involved that they don't get to see their city, their council people, their supervisors. Let me get that straight. They don't get to see their supervisors, and there are different types of interests there. In terms of us being independent, where we are now in the process, we have something called communities of interest, which is an opportunity for people to provide input to us in what's important. When we start to draw district maps, one of the goals is to make sure we're keeping what we call communities of interest together. Those are communities that are based on common characteristics, and they are defined by the people there. It could be economics, it could be a language, it could be cultural, it could be a number of things. And so we're right now in the process of looking at the map, what are called communities of interest. We are receiving maps from the communities. And then from that point, we will start to draw our maps. So I want to be clear about the process. We don't go in with expectations, at least that's our goal. We don't know where the lines will be drawn yet. That's a decision we will make. We don't know if they're going to look like they were in the past or if they're going to be something totally new. We're getting input from the public, and a lot of times that input is based on the current maps. So that's something that's out there in the mix. But right now we've got the communities of interest maps, and that gives us an opportunity to look at the county of Los Angeles and where the interests, like we're seeing, things like Southeast LA, Northeast LA, and East LA, keep them together. We're looking at different parts of maybe the San Fernando Valley. We don't have a lot of input around communities of interest from the African-American community. I will be clear about that. We've gotten some things around Leimert Park, Crenshaw area, some things around the communities of Inglewood, South Los Angeles communities, but we don't have a lot of input. But the other side of that is to think about, as something you've already referenced, Dr. Samad, it's just the African-American population. It is now, I think the population for it's about 9%.
Is that county?
About county, no, it's about, I think 6% in the county.
Right.
It's under 10% in the county. So the question is, when you start to, if we're looking at maps, what kinds of things are we looking at? And at what point can the African-American have influence? Our goal is not to advocate. We represent the whole county, but we come together to create maps that benefit the communities. African-American is part of it. We want to make sure it's represented, but my role is not to be the Black advocate, it's to be a fair advocate. And I'm co-chair of the commission. So we want to make sure that the maps that we draw fairly represent what we believe are the people of the county. So there's a lot of speculation out there. I won't comment on what the maps should look like. We're not into the shoulds. We're going to be into what we believe is the best thing for the county. So maybe that's a good place for me to start and stop.
You saw me here biting my tongue, right?
Yep.
It's the only community that talks that, we got to be fair to other communities when other communities aren't necessarily fair to us. But I'll let your position be your position. I will say that our numbers have dwindled significantly, not only in the county, but in the city of Los Angeles. I think we're now just under 8% of the city, and just under 7% of the county. And one of the things that we're most concerned about is the retention of political power. Other communities are saying we're overrepresented now. And if we look at the history of the charters, both the county charter and the city charter, and we look at the state constitution, both of them are over 100 years old. And they basically, speak to political representation as if it has no filter. And probably prior to 1965, that was true. And that's why we did not have the representation that we should have had.
Can I just add a point?
Sure.
That when I said I do have a Black voice, let me add that as an African-American person there. I do represent the community, even though, it's still about a fair process, but I do want to make sure that our interests are not overlooked And, you know, 'cause I think that we're all looking at the same thing, but if there is an advocate, I want to make sure that the Black interests are heard, but I'm not, you know, it's still a process where there are a number of people at the table. And we're trying to say what is fair for the county, which includes the input of all the people, whether it's Asian or African American or Latino, Armenian, you know, so we're trying to make sure all those are at the table. So and part of that is that Black voice as part of all the others as a collective.
Well, I will say this, and then I'll go to Mr. Watkins, because I know he has some real good institutional memory. Last 2 censuses, we've lost 4 Black seats to Latinos. Okay, those seats that were once Black are now Latino seats. And, you know, I get it, everybody's representing everybody, but everybody's not representing everybody. And I've been a severe critic going back to my column days when Black people, and I wrote about this on several occasions, you know, when Black people are advocating for the disenfranchised, we say Black people and all other minorities. All of the minorities don't say that when they're advocating for themselves, they don't include us in that mix. And I'm waiting for the opportunity to hear somebody include us in that mix. With that, you know, I will go to the legendary Mr. Timothy Watkins, who's the CEO of the Watts Labor Action Committee, a multi-generational self-help, development, cultural footprint in South Los Angeles. Mr. Watkins, take it away.
All right, so on the topic of redistricting, my first encounter with the process was when I was appointed as a commissioner for CD 15. And boy, oh boy, the stories I could tell you that I won't try it today would probably knock your socks off because of all of the turmoil and tumult that's happening just within the past week of, you know, investigations and indictments and all the rest. Man, in 2000, it was nothing to get a phone call from a politician offering $1 million program if you just draw the lines the way he wanted or she wanted them drawn. And don't think there weren't repercussions if you didn't do it. There were serious repercussions. Cost this organization millions of dollars. So I had that experience firsthand. I had the indubious pleasure of Juanita Tate sitting on my lap to persuade me in a small meeting of commissioners one day when Anthony Thigpen happened not to be there. And she thought that she could leverage something in his absence. And I stayed my course. I stayed honest, transparent, true to the appointment, but it gave me a real eye opening look at what happens behind the scenes. 2000, 2010, or whatever you call it, 2011, whatever it was. In the next redistricting, I fought hard to take Watts out of CD 15 and into CD 9. And that's what I think you're referring to, Anthony, because at a point we succeeded. And the map started reflecting Watts as part of CD 9. Again, the political shenanigans behind the scenes created an uproar that we didn't want to be part of. So we stopped our campaign, reversed engines, and we fanned out all over the city, showed up everywhere and said, no, we'll stay in 15 because of the repercussions that CD9 was caused to suffer as a result of taking Watts on. That was a so-called justification for it losing, uh, you know, downtown LA.
Right.
And even though we pulled out, they lost it anyway because behind the scenes there was a real battle going on with several council people and a county supervisor. Now we have the Citizens Redistricting Committee, and bless their hearts, I believe they've done the best they could do under the circumstances, but um, I don't believe that they understand the true magnitude of the situation in some of the communities that they represent. Um, Watts has been disparaged in the process without any relief. Um, we've heard ministers in CD9 say they don't want no part of Watts in CD9. In fact, one group had the audacity to say that if Watts wants to be in CD9, they're going to have to come through us. And, I know churches bang on each other sometimes for congregation reasons, but I'd never heard anything like that because if it was that easy, we would have been in 9. Watts is used to going in, places and disrupting and acting crazy and doing all that stuff. So we tried to put on a campaign of reason that we're the only community in the city of Los Angeles that isn't in the city of Los Angeles. 4 sides of Watts is in the county. And that's part of why we believe we suffer malign neglect in a system that, as Anthony rightfully stated, was created over 100 years ago. And at the time that it was created, there was only 1,000 people in each district. Yeah, 15. I think it was. Am I right? There was a.
Yeah, over 100 years ago. That's right. It was
Yeah.
1,000 people.
And,
Los
and
Angeles wasn't that big. Los Angeles was only about 25,000 people. You
and
know,
if you look at,
the westward migration to Los Angeles came
that's right,
in World War II.
right, the annihilation of the indigenous people to make room for the chosen ones.
Right.
So what we see in the LAUSD archives, which is about the same age as the city council archive, is that when LAUSD was created, there were X number of white kids, 3 Negroes, and an Indian. That's how they characterize the population of the school members at that time in the LA Unified School District. Um, Nothing has changed except the numbers. That this most recent in this most recent census, there's 10,000 people more in each district than there were 10 years ago, roughly. And so the ignorance of anybody saying we don't want nobody new in our district, you already got them. It's just a function of people moving, coming, going, and in the case of Watts, uh, WLCAC has real estate in CD9. Many of our employees live in CD9. We deliver services in CD9, and I'd like to think that we are far more like CD9 than we are like San Pedro and people that shop in Palos Verdes and so on. And so it hurt me. Not much hurts me anymore, Anthony. I'm
Me
good.
either. Me
I'm
either. We
good.
share
I'm
that.
good
We
with
didn't
it.
see such things. Okay.
Yeah. But the truth
Imagine the
is,
preacher wars. I left the
yeah,
church because those Negro preachers in the 80s and the 90s, they used to bang. The preacher wars were worse than the gang wars. Okay.
that's right.
It was really preachers bringing guns to meetings and stuff like that. I mean, it was just ridiculous. You know.
So I just, my problem is that the redistricting commission hasn't corrected the sentiments that suggest that somehow we're not all in the same place already. This is the city of Los Angeles. lines have to be moved simply to rectify the explosion of population and to make that fair and balanced. I have no qualms with that. But Watts suffers this indignity of having been created, and we have all the proof of it, Anthony. It was created with the help of the Ku Klux Klan, who did not want sugar beet farmers that stood ready to be the dominant political force in Watts, that it was annexed in order to do exactly what you said. Redistricting was used back then and as it is now to keep certain groups of people marginalized. And I've tried to talk to Kern Price and Marquise and Herb Wesson and those guys 2 years ago because I saw this coming. And the idea that somehow Watts doesn't help, wouldn't help CD9 hold on longer, I don't get why people don't understand that. CD9 could bring a highly democratic portion of black voting people into CD9 that would bolster. He only won by 1,300 votes or something last time, and we've got 6,000 black voters in Watts that would likely go in that direction. But in CD15, we don't stand a chance of a snowball in hell of ever electing anybody because we are geopolitically gerrymandered.
So let's go to the soldiers who are on the field now. I've been hearing a lot about these players, and I'm real curious to see how they're throwing down. And since you mentioned the preachers, and Reverend Eddie Anderson is on the call, and I believe you were on the local redistricting, the city's redistricting committee. Are you not?
That is correct. I am.
Okay. Hold on, Mr. Samuels. I'm gonna get to you. Sometimes last. His brother was like, I gotta listen to another person. but he referenced, the politics of these redistricting, and the churches, have played a role, just as they have played a role in civil rights, just as they played a role in political action. They have played a role in public policy and public policy outcomes. And so let me, first of all, introduce yourself, and then let me hear, some of your reaction to what Mr. Watkins said.
Yeah, so I'm Reverend Eddie Anderson, Pastor McCarty Church. It's in West Adams, South Central, Sweet Sugar Hill, whatever you want to call it. And I am also the redistricting commissioner for CD10 on the city commission. So you talk about politics. Yeah, man, it's what I find most interesting about this commission, and you see it on the front cover of the LA Times today, where they're talking about, two black councilmen fighting over assets and economic engines. What I found most interesting about this process is the way the maps are drawn. So we don't draw the actual map. We get to give advice and guidance and demographers and help them move the lines. But the question was, in South LA, one, how do we keep the Black CVAP, and CVAP is citizen voting age population. We already talked about how Black population is way down, right? And this magic number that we're trying to get to on this is 260,000 people in every district, in 15 districts and 21 commissioners. So right now, as it stands today, that was the fight, right? How do we get the Black CVAP protected? I'm making sure the VRA is upheld, and that's what we have. Right? We can't draw it based upon race. So to Ms. Kelly's point, we can't draw it based upon race, but we can draw it based upon historically African-American neighborhoods that work together. And so Mr. Watkins, what Tim said, I sympathize. In these meetings, we kept on saying, this is interesting. There was one community, the issue of Koreatown comes up every single time. And they gotta be whole, they gotta be whole, they gotta be whole. But when we bring up Watts, it's we hear you, but we don't. If we have to ask why. right? That's what part of that question. And then getting to the CVAP numbers. So right now, the map as we have now that will probably go to council has in CD10, the CVAP is 32%. In CD9, the CVAP is 25%. And CD15 is 15%. And in CD8 is the only really VRA protected district, it's 51%, right? Though that's majority of where the Black representation comes from in in Los Angeles as a whole. You look at the rest of the city, not there. We also saw, I'm not one to walk away from controversy. You also saw in the LA Times this whole conversation around the map being drawn in a way that erased some districts and moved some people out of the districts. That's also, I think, all of that is in the mix. And the biggest thing that I find interesting is that we had to talk about USC and Expo Park, right? And how those were taken out of aid and what do we do with them now? And as it stands right now, Kirk, you can do, I know you're gonna talk about it, but as it stands right now, as of last night, USC is in CD9 and Expo Park is in CD8. Those have big ramifications, right? Because when you're thinking about 10 years from now, what's happening in LA, you're gonna have World Cups and Olympics and all these types of things. And then that will determine also resources, right? So all of that is in the mix here. And so it was very much a conversation where we do have it to a point where folks have realized once we got to a region 1 or South LA, that they don't want to mess with the VRA. They don't want to risk that representation piece. The question around Watts, I mean, the downtown question in CD9 was a very hard question. We're still considering it, so I can't, say what's going on. But I could say the reason why Watts is in 15 right now, because the only proposal that we got, not that that our staff presented as a viable option per se was to split Watts, which we don't want to do either. Which was also a political thing, which they put in a pigeonhole.
Speak to Mr. Watkins' point about preachers trying to keep, particularly an asset like WLCAC, who, a lot of folk, want to think that they know our communities, but WLCAC is not his daddy's WLCAC. They're developing hundreds of housing units. I mean, they're an economic engine in and of itself, and one of the few in South LA. And West Adams, I'm sorry, young brother, that's not South Central that we grew up with. West Adams was white, and except for Bill Hill over there by First AME Church. And they never, put, West Adams into CD10 until the Bradley years. Ran all the way down to the freeway. What was the one that was the council president? I think that was CD5, and it ran all the way down, and CD10 started at Exposition or something like that, so there has been, this weird morphing of what is South Central, what is South LA, largely because that's where Black people are and that's where Black people congregate. But when you have advocates, and this is, the arguments that I've been getting in with Carolyn, and with Sharif Fremont, who are they? Who there's money behind this that we seem to never get to be able to draw our own maps. And they want to always tell us there is no money, but there is money. And then where do these staffers come from? And what organizations are presenting maps? There's a whole organizing committee around Koreatown that has been funded, that are advocating for their interests. Where where is that organizing? I was part of one that Maxine had in 2000, and we got 2 pieces of 50,000 that we never saw. The committee never saw. Maxine saw it, but people are not doing this on a volunteer basis, is my point. Okay, there are influences that are presenting maps that have been compensated to do so. Is the church one of those bodies that receive money to present maps on behalf of our community?
I think that I can speak on the COI, the community of interest testimonies that we have so far. SELC was the only major church-related organization that has presented maps to the commission and a formal presentation. And then from the community, Kirk and the brothers and sisters at People's Block presented their map to the community that was actually presented to a commission at Mass to do that. Outside of that, the other faith communities, there hasn't been a lot, right? First of all, of a lot of involvement from preachers outside of districts where outside of CD9, those probably the most we've heard. And then in CD 10, we heard some preachers say, we're good where we're at. CD8, we heard crickets from that part of the faith community there. And so it's also about people mobilizing and being aware, but I would say the only map that we have seen presented formally to the commission and had a whole 15-minute special presentation outside of People's Block that was a pro-Black map or African-American map was SCLC. And then that was what people, the other commissioners are languishing over. What do we do with these propositions?
Yeah, nobody wants to get in the middle of a family fight. We're going to go over about 10 minutes because I'm going to give Mr. Samuels his 10 minutes to lay out his view of what this conversation has been about, particularly with respect to some of the historical infighting that has taken place that has caused us in many ways to lose some critical assets in our districts. So Mr. Kirk Samuels, please introduce yourself. Tell us what role you have in this redistricting process and what you think about what Reverend Anderson and Mr. Watkins had to say about this process.
Well, thank you, Dr. Samad, and thank you, Sanctuary of Hope, for allowing me to speak this afternoon. I'm Kirk Samuels. I'm the Director of Civic Engagement for Community Coalition in South Los Angeles, and I'm also co-convener of the People's Block, which is about 30 organizations across the County of Los Angeles that found alignment in equity and solidarity and centering community voice and centering power building organizations in this redistricting process. So I want to lift that first before I even get into the 8, 9, and 10 debacle and all that. Our main priority from our inception has always been to put our people first and to give them a platform in this process, because historically we have not had that. And it shows in the districts that we live in. 8 and 9 are both 2 of the poorest districts in LA County, and that's not by coincidence, that's by design. So we wanted to make sure that we had a footprint in this redistricting process the entire way. So we've been able to host over dozens of workshops, community workshops. We brought out hundreds of our community members and we spoke to them directly, and we asked them, what is your experience? What do you want to see in this redistricting process? We broke it down to them, we explained the process to them, and then we helped them just understand how they harness this power. This is a power that's led by the people. I mean, this is a process that's led by the people. So I just wanted to lift that up. For us, it's always been protecting Black equity seats. It's protecting Black political power in Los Angeles. And it really starts in 2020 with the census process, with COVID-19, with a racist administration that put a lot of fear in folks, that was messing with the census timeline, that caused the undercount, that caused us to lose a congressional seat, that caused folks to even question the process in general. I think dealing with that is the first part, because when you have that, that throws off the entire redistricting process. So going forward from there, we knew that we had an uphill battle, and we knew that we had to really get aggressive when it came to putting our folks in the position to really advocate for their wants and for their needs, to be able to find those shared interests, to be able to find the alignment so we can protect that Black political power for the next 10 years. And unfortunately, when we saw the census data when it was released, it confirmed what a lot of us already knew on this call and what a lot of us already knew in California, is that there's an exodus of Black folks in Los Angeles County because of displacement, because of gentrification, because of high rents. And this is something that we have to account for through redistricting. So we wanted to figure out how can we draw the lines where we can protect us for the next 10 years and make sure that we have a footprint in this city. So when it comes to, the assets of what's going on in 8 and 9, we heard from our community that we went without for the past 10 years. And what happened in the 2010 redistricting cycle, another political argument that, my two previous panelists spoke on, we know what happened, and it's done. Our thing is how do we stop the bleeding? And then how do we build? How do we sustain what we have? How do we maintain what we have? I think that's the biggest question. And we know that if we have one VRA district, like Pastor or Reverend Anderson said, we have one VRA district, this is going to account for a lot of Black political power. We need to make sure that this district has the assets that it needs. We need to make sure that the council understands that. We need to make sure that the commissioners understand that. It was essential to the folks that we spoke to. This was a common theme that kept coming up. I have been in so many community meetings where we've heard folks say that we don't have assets. We have to drive an hour, 2 hours to go grocery shopping. We can't do certain things in our community. So that was something that, was coming back up and that we felt was important to acknowledge. Another thing we learned in the redistricting workshops that we had is that folks were concerned about losing their elected officials. We're concerned about being grouped with communities that didn't share their same interests. So that was another issue that was at the forefront. So we started with the map drafting, where folks were identifying their boundaries, and we were able to submit those communities of interest to our commissioners. And we're there every step of the way to make sure that we're maintaining the power and that we're not losing it. And another thing that we want to work for is, unfortunately, it could get a lot really bureaucratic, but this isn't 8 versus 9 type of thing. This is maintaining Black power. This is maintaining Black equity seats. This has always been our forefront. And unfortunately, the message could be lost, but this is always going to be at the forefront because we understand what the Black vote means. We understand how important that is going forward.
Well, I think that we witnessed not just on the South end of Black Los Angeles, but in 2010, Herb and Parks couldn't agree, where the Baldwin Hills Crenshaw Mall was going to land, so they split the mall. Part of the mall is in 10, part of the mall is in 8. I mean, that's the kind of madness that we've dealt with, because they want to cherry pick assets. We've seen a lot around SC, where SC was in 9 and then SC was in 8. SC was in 8 when Bob Farrell was councilman, and then it went over into 9, and then, in order to keep part of downtown, they had to, take SC to make up for the part of downtown that they lost. And so it's not all about the population parity. They're battling for strategic physical assets, which of course represent drivers in our community in terms of creating jobs, in terms of creating entrepreneurial opportunities and quality of life. But some areas have been stigmatized, Watts being one of them. And of course, when you look at, what is coming out of Watts now, particularly with our housing crisis, why wouldn't a district like 9 want to pick up, a WLCAC, who is developing, more housing units than any other entity in that part of town. So Carolyn, I'm gonna come back to you real quick. Based on what you've heard from these three gentlemen, how do you see, the supervisorial thing is a whole different kind of pie, because they only have to cut it 5 ways, and they've been talking about expanding the Board of Supervisors, but the uniqueness of the Board of Supervisors is it is the 3rd most powerful position in the United States, behind the President of the United States and governors, because they're the only entity that acts as both executive and legislative. They make their laws and then they turn around and implement their laws, which is part of the conflictions that they're, because it just ain't one, okay? It's all 5 of them on some level. And
sometimes it's only one.
Yeah, sometimes it's only, you say sometimes it's only one. Right. I mean, and so it's not as complicated as the city of Los Angeles, and the city of Los Angeles really kind of needs to expand too. Looking at the New York models or the Chicago models, you can't operate a city of 6 million people, and then divided by 15 and think that you are going to satisfactorily service all of those constituents. How do you see this playing out, Carolyn?
Well, one of the things there are a number of differences between the city and the county. Even though there's a citizens commission for LA City, it still goes back to the elected officials, as I understand it, to finalize this, which means they can move it over or do what they want. With the county, ours go direct, they have no input at all. So when we finish our maps, they're put into, they will be enacted. There's no final vote from the supervisors at all. What I'm hearing though, and we're not, the city's ahead of us. Our final maps are due December 15th. So we're at the process of just now starting to get maps. We're encouraging people to get the maps in, I think in the next week, but they will be able to submit maps to us where they draw the lines. We've got communities of interest. But what I've heard from people, it's a lot about political power. I know there's some economic engines in there, but people want to have they want to have the electoral power to elect people who represent them. And part of that, when you start to hear that, the question is, where's the African-American power? Are we looking at what we call coalitions now? You mentioned that earlier, to have our voices heard because our population numbers are small. And when we draw the maps, the African-American population is mostly in a particular district that exists now. We don't know what's going to happen with that. I don't want to speculate. I can't do any predictions, but we also look at, the voter analysis, the same kind of thing you're looking at, where people, because part of what the Voting Rights Act says, you've got to create districts, if you can, majority minority districts wherever possible. So we're not there yet. So we don't know what that's going to look like. And I think that's some of what the city has been looking at. Where does that move? Where does that end? We've got a number of, it's not just a growing Latino population, we've got a growing Asian population in the county as well, with a smaller African-American population. But I'm hoping people will get involved and pay attention to where we're going with the county, because the county has a history of gerrymandering. It has a history for years of overlooking the Latino population.
Well, even though the 2nd district is the black seat, it's also known as the Kenny Hahn seat, and he wasn't black.
Right.
And the Asians are making some noise, excluded from the County Board of Supervisors. So, I'm sure that politic is playing real heavy. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Were you through with your point? Because I want to get back to these three gentlemen because
I'm good because I think the city is really right now where the action is. Our time is coming when we're going to have some of these conversations. So I'm with you. Let's go back to the city of LA.
Right. All right, Mr. Watkins, you heard what this current generation of street warriors have said. You know, what's your reaction to that?
Well, from my knowledge as a former commissioner, I know that there are two primary aims of the Redistricting Commission: to identify communities and keep communities of interest together, and to make the districts as contiguous as they can be. And with Watts, as I pointed out, it's not even in the city. It's surrounded on 3 2/3 sides by the county. It's clear that the only purpose we serve is to connect San Pedro to resources that are doled out day after day after day to fight the so-called condition of poverty. And the resources that come to CD 15 to address poverty in Watts, 9 out of 10 times end up down in San Pedro and so on. There's no way for 40,000 people in Watts to ever elect the leader of a district that has 230 or 220,000 people down in the harbor. Those are Greek fishermen and Italian culinary people, and those are going to be predominantly Republican people. And I was told by the group called Indivisible. Indivisible is a network of 6,000 groups across the nation that are concerned for democracy. And that group told me the reason that you can't take Watts out of CD 15 is because it would go Republican. That's what I was told. Whether it's true or not, Watts is decidedly Democratic voting. And
Right.
I just don't get why the powers that be don't understand that putting it in 9 is not giving up something in 15, it's making something better in 9.
Well, I'm hearing the streets are talking, and there's the possibility that there will be a Black woman running for that council seat in 15.
Yeah, but you know, them white boys are very tricky wabbits, right? So, you know, no matter who's watching,
Is that she gonna get her
I
head
get to
bumped?
say,
Is that what you're
hey,
trying to say?
as the only one that looks like a white man on this show, I get to say that, right? And I get to say it with a real acute awareness and understanding. And so the guy that's running for CD 15, Tim McCosker, has been in this office, I don't know, 5 or 10 times, trying to familiarize himself with us. He's been showing up at neighborhood council meetings and Watts Gang Task Force meetings, talking to people about the meaning of redistricting. And then he drops that bomb in the process of, well, you know, they could split. They're talking about possibly splitting Watts. And anytime he's talking about, you know, or splitting the baby were his words. Anytime you use that analogy, you strike fear in somebody's hearts, because the most horrific thing you could imagine would be the graphic splitting of a baby. And so when you put that to Watts, which is only 2 miles square and outside of the city, how are you going to split it? It only connects through a small part of the west side to CD8. So where are you going to, you know? So I'm frustrated with it. I stopped rallying people to come to the meetings because I've also been informed that the decision is going to be made by the council, period. That whatever the redistricting commission submits, the final decision is going to be made by the decision makers with the authority. And so, you know, I don't know how different this is than 10 years ago or 20 years ago.
You don't think that you have an advocate on the council? Is that what you're saying?
I'm not going to say that because, you know, I think that there are good people on there council, they're good people on redistricting commission. But you know, you need 8 votes. I don't
Right.
know if there's 8 good ones for Watts.
Reverend Anderson, does Watts have an advocate?
Uh,
I'm just asking the question. Hey, if y'all don't want me to ask the questions, don't ask me to be moderator. I'm asking the hard one. Okay.
It doesn't matter, does it? It doesn't really matter. Because it's, you know, again, it's 8 votes.
You're muted, Reverend Anderson.
Yeah, I would just say, Tim is correct and Carolyn's correct. After we vote on Thursday, it goes to the council. What happens after that is up to them, which is different than the county. That's why our timeline is also condensed. I also want to make sure that's clear, whoever's watching this. The reason why our timeline is condensed, we get to be done by October, is because the council has to have at least 4 public hearings on the maps, and they needed November and December to do that in order to have it voted by the 31st. So they have to do their job as well.
So with them suspending the councilman in CD 10, does that mean that the CD 10 is going to be ravished because they won't have an advocate on the council?
I don't know.
You don't know, huh? That's one of them unknowns. That's one of them unintended consequences that's about to happen. Yeah. Mr. Samuels, how do you see us protecting those 3 districts in a way that adequately represents the communal interests and culture of Blacks in South Los Angeles?
I think it's just doing what we've been doing. And that's calling in and letting our voices be heard, talking to the commissioners and letting them know that this is what's important to us. I think we've been doing a great job thus far. Unfortunately, we don't have, or we started out with alignment. It got a little foggy, a little murky, but I think overall it's us letting them know that we have a footprint in the city and that we want to see our communities thrive. Nobody is advocating for South LA except for South LA. Nobody's going to pull out the stops for us. And we have to build people power, and we have to let them know that this is what we want to see. This is important to us. These are our homes. This is where we grow up. This is where we work, and we deserve to benefit off all these developments and structures that are in our communities. So it doesn't make sense to be drawing these outside of our communities. So I think that, I'm an always optimistic person, and I'm a man of faith as well. So I know that, if we advocate, in my generation's term, if we push the line, if we go hard, we can definitely get the results we need. And I'm another firm believer that worst case scenario, regardless of what happens, we still organize and we still build. It doesn't matter who's elected. It doesn't matter how it's drawn. We're going to show back up, and we're going to continue to fight, because this is the only way that we get the progress. And this is what we've been doing for the last 250 years. So we can't expect anything different, especially for the Black community.
Okay, so we're about 20 minutes over. Let me say this. We have one last thing to say.
Can we get to Anthony? Can you call whoever you think back together for the 15 to 21 campaign? You've heard of 15 to 9, right?
Right.
15 to 21 seats. Let's get that going.
Yeah, well, that's really the next conversation, is both the expansion of the council and the board of supervisors. And we certainly can have some platform discussions about that at this Hills. I promise you I'll follow up on that, because we need to begin. We can't continue to use this antiquated model and try to fit, everybody's interests in a model that no longer serves the purpose.
That's right.
That really kind of destroys community and really destroys sense of community.
Days before submitting our final map. So yes, if people are still interested in presenting maps and providing maps to the county, do that now. And next week, we'll be looking at you presenting those maps to us. All that information is on our website.
All right. We'd like to thank Sanctuary of Hope, Ms. Janet Kelly, who always looking to get right into the crux of the issue, and she invites panelists that are not afraid to pull punches and talk about the hard things. That's what I love about this Black Narrative series. And maybe we have a conversation, Ms. Kelly, about the 15 to 21, the expansion of the city council. I'm going to make an appointment to go down and talk to Mr. Watkins about it and see if we can pull critical mass around that concept. It's time for us to really change that political paradigm of 15 city council seats. And quite as kept, the 5 supervisorial seats. So that might be the next direction for our political engagement in terms of not, splitting the pie in smaller slivers, but, expanding the pie. And that's where I think we have to go. So again, we'd like to thank our audience for watching. If you have any questions, be sure to put all of your emails and information in the chat, and email or call these wonderful panelists, and put them on, notice that you want to contact them about some things that they discuss, or you may want to join with them to advocate for a more favorable map to come to our community. So again, I'm Dr. Anthony Asadullah Samad. I'm the director of the Mervyn Donnelly Institute, and we thank you and we see you next time when we take up the Sanctuary of Hope's Black Narrative series.
Thank you, Dr. Samad, and our panelists for amazing discussion on redistricting. I'm quite sure our audience learned a lot from you. But at this time, as we're getting ready to close, I want to invite you audience to join Sanctuary of Hope on November the 1st at 6 p.m. for our Homeless Youth Awareness Kickoff event, which is themed around advancing racial equity for justice-involved youth. It will be a great opportunity for you to be inspired and learn about the resiliency of our young people, as well as the resiliency of our community to create a support system and network that uplifts our youth. Thank you again and have a great afternoon.